Stephen had spent years crafting a life of control, precise, measured, and untouched by chaos. His work, his age. Then came Sarah, a woman effortless, affectionate, full of laughter. He wasn't a casual conversation turned into lingering dinners, stolen kisses, and the kind of companionship that felt like it had always been waiting for him. Saying I do had felt lick. But Sarah came with a piece of her past, Ryan. 1919. Distant, unreadable, a son who. Stephen had convinced himself their worlds would run parallel, never colliding, never shifting the rhythm of his perfect life. But in time, he would realize Ryan wasn't just watching him, he was studying him. And the day their paths finally crossed, there would be no turning back. At first, Stephen dismissed it as nothing, a trick of his imagination, a byproduct of their strained dynamic. Ryan was polite, always just distant enough to avoid real conversation, but not rude. Their relationship existed in the quiet spaces of the house, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were merely two men living under the same roof. Not a family. But then, something shifted. It started with the way Ryan looked at him, not with hostility. Not with disinterest, but with something sharp, assessing, a gaze that lingered a second too long before flickering away, as if he were studying Stephen rather than simply seeing him. Then came the moments that felt like tests. A brush of their shoulders in the hallway. The way Ryan stood a little too close when reaching for a glass in the kitchen. His voice dropping just slightly when he spoke. One night, while Sarah worked late, Stephen made dinner, expecting the usual silent exchange before Ryan disappeared into his room. But instead, Ryan lingered at the table, fingers absently tapping against the rim of his water glass, eyes steady. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly, voice low, unreadable. Stephen looked up, pulse skipping for a reason he didn't understand. "Expected?" Ryan smirked, something knowing in his expression. "Mom's taste in men used to be different." He dragged the tines of his fork slowly between his lips, watching Stephen as he did. And for the first time, Stephen felt it, the beginning of something he wasn't sure he could ignore. Number 3. Write more smoothly and creatively. ChatGPT da noi. The tension between them didn't break, it stretched, tightening around Stephen like an invisible thread. Pulling, waiting to snap. He told himself it was all in his head. That Ryan was just a guarded young man, still adjusting to a new dynamic. But if that were true, why did every encounter feel like a carefully placed move in a game he didn't know he was playing? Ryan's presence in the house became impossible to ignore. He was there before Stephen even noticed him, leaning against the kitchen counter, lounging on the living room couch, standing too close in the hallway. It wasn't obvious enough to call out, but it was deliberate. Stephen could feel it. Then came the way Ryan moved. The slow, effortless stretches that made his shirt ride up just enough to reveal toned skin. The casual way he leaned against doorframes, watching Stephen with something unreadable in his eyes. The smirk that followed every time Stephen's gaze flickered somewhere it shouldn't. One morning, Stephen stood by the coffee maker, willing his pulse to settle, when Ryan stepped in behind him, close. Too close. The warmth of his body was barely an inch away. "Smells good," Ryan murmured, his voice lower than usual. Stephen swallowed hard, gripping the counter. "It's just coffee." "Still," Ryan mused, reaching past him, his arm grazing Stephen's waist, fingertips just barely ghosting over fabric. Stephen exhaled slowly, but Ryan didn't move away. He was waiting. And Stephen hated how much he wanted to know what for. The drive into the city was quiet, filled only with the low hum of the radio and the occasional flick of Ryan's fingers against the car door. Stephen kept his eyes on the road, pretending he didn't notice the way Ryan's gaze shifted toward him every so often. At Sarah's office, the building was nearly deserted, the late hour leaving the lobby eerily still. Stephen pressed the elevator button, expecting Ryan to stay behind. But instead, he followed, stepping inside without a word. The ride should have been uneventful, a short ascent, a quick errand, and then back to the car. But halfway up, the lights flickered, And with a sudden jolt, the elevator shuddered to a stop. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Great," Ryan muttered, leaning back against the wall, exhaling through his nose. Stephen pressed the emergency button, listening to the useless beep before sighing. The space between them was too small, the air too warm. Ryan shifted, and when Stephen turned his head, he found those dark eyes watching him again, steady, unreadable. "Doesn't it ever feel like things aren't what they're supposed to be?" Ryan's voice was softer this time, thoughtful, but heavy with something else. Stephen felt his pulse slow, not in relief, but in awareness. And then, Ryan moved, just a breath closer, his gaze flickering between Stephen's mouth and his eyes, waiting. Stephen didn't move, and when Ryan kissed him, he didn't pull away. The first time was hesitation, the second was hunger. Stephen should have stopped it. The moment their lips met in that suffocating elevator, he should have shoved Ryan away, reminded himself, who they were. But he hadn't. Instead, he let it happen, let Ryan press closer, let the heat coil between them, let the moment stretch into something dangerous. And now, there was no undoing it. The days after were unbearable. The air inside the house had changed, thicker, charged with something neither of them spoke about but both of them felt. Sarah was still oblivious, still warm and affectionate, but Stephen could barely focus when Ryan was in the room. Then came the night that sealed it. Stephen was in his study, trying, failing, to work when the door creaked open. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Ryan stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He wasn't asking permission. He wasn't waiting for an invitation. "Tell me you don't think about it," Ryan murmured, stopping just short of Stephen's desk. Stephen clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the papers beneath his fingertips. But when Ryan leaned down, his breath warm against Stephen's throat, when his fingers ghosted over Stephen's wrist, he didn't move away. The moment shattered between them, a collision of lips, hands, bodies pressing, kneading. Ryan pushed Stephen back into the chair, straddling his lap, stealing every ounce of restraint Stephen had left. And this time, Stephen didn't fight it, he let it consume him. After that night, there was no more pretending. It didn't stop in the study. It didn't stop anywhere. The need that had been simmering beneath the surface had finally boiled over. And there was no containing it now. Every stolen moment became an opportunity, a brush of fingers that lingered too long. A passing glance that burned with silent promises. They were reckless, too reckless. Sarah would be in the next room, oblivious, while Ryan pressed Stephen against the kitchen counter, lips tracing the line of his jaw, whispering things that made Stephen's breath hitch. The study, once a space for quiet solitude, became a battleground of restraint, papers scattered, clothes pushed aside in desperation. In the shower, where the water masked their quiet gasps, where Stephen could press Ryan against the tiles, feel him tremble beneath his touch. It should have felt wrong. It should have been unbearable guilt, suffocating regret, but it wasn't. It was fire, intoxicating and all-consuming. And Ryan knew it. He thrived in it. "I like watching you try not to want me," he murmured one night, his fingers tracing slow circles against Stephen's thigh beneath the dinner table. Sarah just a few feet away. Stephen swallowed hard, his pulse hammering, but he didn't move, and that was the worst part. He didn't want to. They were playing with fire, and the flames were getting too high. But neither of them could stop. Not now. It had to end. Stephen told himself this every night, when he lay beside Sarah, feeling her warmth but thinking of someone else. When he sat across from Ryan at the dinner table, pretending his pulse wasn't hammering from the memory of the last time they'd been alone. This wasn't just reckless anymore. It was dangerous. It was unsustainable. Sarah had planned a weekend trip to visit family, 2 days away, leaving Ryan and Stephen alone in the house with nothing but the silence between them. Stephen knew he should make himself scarce, find reasons to be anywhere but here. But he didn't, and neither did Ryan. The first night was inevitable. Ryan didn't wait. He found Stephen in the dim glow of the living room, moving with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. "We're not doing this again," Stephen whispered, though even he didn't believe it. Ryan only smirked, stepping closer, hands sliding beneath Stephen's shirt, fingers skimming over his ribs. "Then stop me." But Stephen didn't. He let Ryan push him back against the couch. Let him straddle his waist. Let himself unravel beneath the weight of everything they had tried to ignore. By morning, neither of them had slept. Stephen's body ached, his skin still burning with the imprint of Ryan's touch. And when Sarah called to check in, he knew, with sickening clarity, that he had already lost the fight. There was no walking away now. The guilt came in waves, but the need never left. Stephen told himself that night was the last time. But Ryan knew better. The way he looked at Stephen afterward, the way he carried himself with that quiet confidence, it was clear he wasn't afraid of the consequences. If anything, he thrived in them. Sarah returned, filling the house with her usual warmth, completely unaware of the storm raging just beneath the surface. She kissed Stephen like nothing had changed. But everything had. Her touch felt foreign now. A reminder of the line he had crossed. The line he had obliterated. And Ryan, he didn't play coy anymore. He didn't pretend. A touch in passing, a smirk that spoke volumes. A brush of fingers against Stephen's wrist just as Sarah walked into the room. Then, one evening, as Sarah curled up beside him on the couch, Ryan walked in, fresh from the shower, hair damp, sweatpants hanging low on his hips. He leaned against the wall, eyes locked onto Stephen's, watching, waiting. Stephen swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. But Ryan knew he had won. Later that night, as Stephen stood alone in the kitchen, Ryan appeared behind him, breath warm against his ear. "Tell me you regret it," he whispered, his hands slipping beneath Stephen's shirt, fingers skimming his stomach. Stephen exhaled sharply, fighting a battle he had already lost. Because the truth was, he didn't regret it. Not even a little. Stephen knew it had to stop. Knew it with every ragged breath, every pounding heartbeat, every stolen moment that blurred the line between desire and destruction. But knowing and doing were two very different things. Ryan wasn't letting go. He wasn't fading into the background. Wasn't pretending like this was some fleeting mistake. No, he was taunting Stephen with the weight of everything they had done. Everything they were still doing. One evening, Stephen sat in his study. The door cracked open just enough to let the sound of Sarah humming in the kitchen drift through. Normalcy, safety, everything he was supposed to want. And then Ryan was there, slipping inside like a shadow. Stephen didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel him. The door clicked shut. "You're going to leave me, aren't you?" Ryan's voice was soft, but there was something behind it, something that almost sounded like hurt. Stephen exhaled slowly. "This has to end." Silence, then footsteps, then warmth, too close, too intoxicating. "Tell me you don't want me," Ryan whispered, fingers brushing Stephen's jaw. "Say it, and I'll walk away." Stephen's hands curled into fists. His body betrayed him before his words could. Ryan saw it, he felt it. And then he kissed him, hard, desperate, consuming. Stephen broke apart beneath him, knowing this wasn't just lust. This was obsession, and it was never going to stop.